So the time is almost upon us. I was looking around here for some sort of bell that I could ring, like the town crier, announcing that the warbands will soon be entering into the cursed city of Mordheim, searching for that weird stone to sell to the highest bidders. And Mordheim's a game that I really, really enjoy playing a couple of times a year with a bunch of friends. We played over a Saturday or a Sunday, condensed in a campaign. So that time is approaching, usually around July, August. So I'm looking at what warband do I want to run. Now, certainly my friends know it's going to be basically like maybe 3. Witch Hunters, Dwarven Treasure Hunters. I know they're a little bit later, but the Possessed, Chaos warbands. I love that aspect of it because it pulls in not only the narrative, serving the dark gods, controlling a group of fanatics, but also what I find in the game, 3 key pieces. And that's what I want to explore with this warband for those of you thinking of jumping into this game, or also if you've been playing for some time, thinking about maybe moving out into different warbands, recognizing that, yes, we all have our own play style. We all have aspects of the game that we enjoy. You want to be kind of upfront, in your face. For the Emperor, Witch Hunters. You want to be a little more sneaky, Skaven. You want to have that summoning ability and pull in some things. Maybe you go with the undead. And of course, if you are incorporating hirelings and mercenaries, you can pull in other aspects. So this idea that you can have a primary playstyle that hits upon the 3 areas of Mordheim, and that's what we're going to look at. If it's deficient in one area, you get around that by hirelings. But that costs crowns. And depending on the rule set, they don't level up. So what I love about the Possessed, if I just strip it down to the narrative, strip away the narrative and just look at the evolution of the warband, it has the 3.5 aspects that I really, really think is important, covering all bases in the game. So the first, this is in no particular order, it's not like it's ranked, access to magic. Magic is based on old school Warhammer fantasy. The spells are kind of random. They don't always happen like you'd like. There's somewhat of a risk. You are going off of old Games Workshop thinking, so it's going to be random. But you want to have access to magic to utilize as a potential resource. Just A, to use, but B, if it's going to be random and I'm going to throw that random out there, that's something my opponent has to contend with. It could be potentially game enhancing. Now, I can hire a wizard, I can hire a warlock, I can hire a necromancer, but the Cult of the Possessed, they have the Magister stock having access to these powers through the Dark Gods. So your leader in the warband can unlock this and utilize magic. I won't say for free because it's built into the cost, but that's a great starting point. I don't have to go outside of the warband to pull that in. And also the advantage there, again, rules as written, I can pull in, Dwarven Treasure Hunters don't have access. Now, would the dwarves work with a wizard, necromancer, sorcerer? Okay, we can come up with some narrative. I pay those crowns, then, well, first of all, that's taking away from the armor and black powder upgrades that I want to give them. But also, the wizard, sorcerer, necromancer won't be leveling up. The stats are locked. The Magister for the Possessed, I'm going to level up. Second aspect, ideally, you want some sort of blocker, some sort of area denial. What we'll see sometimes are, depending on the mission, some weird stone is stashed in a house somewhere. You move into the house, you roll to see if it's not there. If it's not, then that house is kind of marked as empty, and eventually you discover it. And if we break down the game, the wargaming table that we're playing onto a grid, if you can take a piece that is really, really strong, great example, a troll, and park that and shut down a sector. So think if you place that troll down, how fast can it move? How fast can it charge? How fast can it attack? 360. Then from that perspective, or based on what it can move, that means potentially anything that moves into that Yes, they can catch you at range, but you can hide or be behind a building, be out of line of sight. That radius shuts things down. The possessed itself becomes this. Now, the interesting thing about the possessed, as it gobbles down Weirdstone and upgrades, it's a very potent model. It's a very powerful model. It's a very expensive model. And the more that you work to get experience and level it up, the replacement cost becomes very, very high. So what you find in a skirmish game like this is when you have a powerful model, you can't be everywhere at once with the model. So it's a more of a defensive type model, area type denial, or a battering ram type model. If the opposing warband is one of the missions is where they're defending a find. They've discovered some Weirdstone. They've got a fortification. They're in a building, and you got to take it and attack it. I'm sending that possessed potentially straight in. So you want to be. It plays vastly different than a mass scale miniature war game as a Death Star. Other warbands, Dwarven Treasure Hunters, and I use them as a reference because I play them. The individual models, they're pretty tough. They're pretty strong across the spectrum. But they don't have that number one really, really strong miniature model, so you got to pull it in. Cult of the Possessed have it, but it's not without its drawbacks. Third, the frontline fighters and second-tier fighters. You've got the Dark Soul, and then you also have the cultists themselves. The Dark Soul's pretty good. The cultists themselves, they're not great. They're not bad. They're essentially fodder. I equip them the least. If I lose them, they're easy enough to recruit. If I'm going to look for gobbling Weirdstone or ways to gain experience to deliver the kill, I want that, of course, on my... usually it's Magister first, Possessed second, and then maybe Dark Soul third. I try not to have the cultists themselves get too much experience because as they gain, yes, they become more powerful, but I'd rather spend my experience on other things. I don't have super mass cheap troops, say like Skaven if you're going into that expansion, but they're solid enough. So I feel like this idea that if we looked at the phases of the game, and of course, again, this is not to say the other warbands don't have their strengths, and the Cult of the Possessed/Possessed have Chaos, a lot of weaknesses that we need to take advantage of or be aware of, depending on if you're fighting them or not. But I find the phases of the game where, like, you want to have access to magic. We got it. You want to have access to being able to have a battering ram area denial piece. We've got it. And you want your kind of henchmen to be somewhat solid, not super, super weak. Because if they are super weak or generally a little bit weaker like the Skaven, then that puts them with missile weapons, do the usual sling exploit, that puts them as wanting to stay back and maybe a little bit more defensive from that perspective. The rank and file cultists are just good enough, being that human template, that they work in the system.